Good morning. Mr. Peters, we got a fascicle of 90-something pages from you through the email. That is supposed to be your submissions, your written submissions.
Those are the written submissions on behalf of the Guyana
Yeah,
Service.
we thank you for the details. That is why I asked you to let us have a skeleton argument. That was not forthcoming. It is therefore humanly impossible for us to read through that document which we received this morning. And so I will depend on you to be very relevant and concise. You would ask for an hour. Is that right?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Well, the commission will give you half an hour. And you, with your skill, will be able to distill it properly for us.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Thank you for allowing the Guyana Prison Service to present our arguments today. On behalf of the Guyana Prison Service, we thank you and the Commission staff for the complete review which you will undertake of all materials, and for the attention that you will pay to assess the lengthy and detailed submissions contained in our written representation and in the materials that we've presented to the Commission throughout the inquiry. The submissions made on behalf of the Guyana Prison Service Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These submissions are made on behalf of the ranks and officers of the Guyana Prison Service to accomplish the forward objectives: to put before the Commission of Inquiry relevant facts and arguments to assist it in its task pursuant to the terms of reference, to point out errors and omissions in the inmates' evidence, to persuade the Commission of Inquiry that the evidence viewed fairly and objectively illustrates that the staff of the Guyana Prison Service, who were on duty on the morning of the 3rd of March 2016, and thereafter acted in compliance with standard operating procedures of the Guyana Prison Service, to persuade the Commission of Inquiry that the evidence viewed fairly and objectively does not support any theory that the death of 17 prisoners was as a result of negligence, abandonment of duty, disregard of instructions, inaction of prison officers who were on duty on the night of March 2nd, 2016, and the morning of March 3rd, 2016, to submit recommendations to the Commission. We also want to begin by letting you know very clearly that the Guyana Prison Service, its officers corps and its ranks, are committed to fairness, they're committed to human rights, and they're committed to the rule of law, including the Constitution. We want that to be very clear. I will now deal with a skeletal of part 3 of my written arguments, which deals with the institutional context, and I will give you a summary of that.
Would you be kind enough to lay over a hard copy? I don't have one yet. Not now, of course, at the termination of today's proceeding.
A hard copy
of the skeletal thing you...
Oh, yes, I can do that, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
It's much shorter than
Yeah.
yes, I can do that. The Georgetown prison faced several challenges pre-March 2nd and March 4th, 2016. And those challenges includes the location of the prison in the center of the city in close proximity to business and civilian communities, the high number of special watch and high-profile inmates, incarceration of an increasingly violent population, inadequate facilities to segregate and separate various classes of inmates, rising gangs and organized crimes by inmates within the walls of the prison, inadequate staff and gender imbalance in staffing, inadequate staff to inmate ratio, buildings constructed of wood within the prisons that were inadequate and hazardous to inmates and prison staff, overcrowding of the prison, inordinate delays in criminal matters moving forward in various courts, high level of prisoners being denied bail, particularly in the West Coast Magisterial District. And we said this, Mr. Chairman, in paragraph 280 of our written submissions. And it is respectfully submitted that the evidence submitted by Superintendent Pilgrim to the Commission of Inquiry indicates that the Georgetown prison is characterized by overcrowding, local gangs, and violence. It was his evidence that there is now the general trend of inmates trying to instill fear and intimidation in ranks, which has now contributed to a large number of officers reporting sick and absenting themselves from duty. Chief Officer Barker testifies that prisoners have become more disrespectful to lawful authority and brazen. And as well, the chronic shortage of custodial staff has increased the prisoner-to-prisoner violence. And that has taken on a much more violent posture. And as you've heard recently, there have been quite a few hospitalizations post-March 3rd, 2016. So that is the institutional context I've given you. And I see I have spent 4 minutes doing that. So I'm doing well in terms of my time. Now I move to the focus of the inquiry. And that's addressed in part 5 of our written submissions. And the first task the Commission has is to examine the causes, circumstances, and conditions that led to the disturbance on the morning of the 3rd of March 2016 that resulted in the death of 17 prisoners on the morning. Oops, it seems like it's runs on. In any event, we understand that the Commission is asked to look at the events on March 2nd. And those events on March 2nd began with the joint service search, where a number of
The events which began on March 2nd.
Sorry.
Is that what you're saying?
No, I said my understanding, sir, is that the Commission is asked to look at the events from March 2nd.
From? Yeah, then
Yes.
it's from. Oh.
Yes. And so we say that the first significant event was the joint service search and the unearthing of the prohibited items that were found in that unit, Capital Block A, Capital Block B, and the other units. But I suspect the Commission is mostly focused on the new Capital Division. You heard evidence from Chief Officer Wolfield Romanos, and he testified that on March 2nd, 2016, he was detailed to work the 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. shift. And he testified that about 1:45 p.m., he was instructed by Assistant Superintendent of Prisons, Don Jordan, to report to the Capital Block A as the commander for that search team. He told you that he briefed the prison officers and the police officers and that a search was conducted. He told you about the items that were recovered, and he also told you as well about the challenges that faced the officers during the search, including the nature of how the building constructed made it very difficult for the officers to unearth certain items due to the infrastructure of the building. You heard evidence from Collison, and he testified that he has a Facebook page. He did not directly admit that he had a cell phone in his possession, but he let you know that he updated his Facebook page regularly. The commission knows that there are cell phones in the prison, and so it's an inference that the commission could draw that Carlos Carlson has a cell phone. He admitted that illicit drugs such as marijuana is prevalent in the prison and in his division. He also admitted to seeing improvised weapons, cell phones, scissors, lighters, cigarettes. Inmate Dwayne Lewis, he also testified that cell phones, marijuana, and alcohol are smuggled into the prisons, and that such items brought comfort and calm to the prisoners. Inmate James testified that he has not observed any cell phones, lighters, marijuana, or other prohibited items in Capital Block A. But inmate James incredibly testified as well that we lit mattresses. So if he's saying we lit mattresses, but he's never seen lighters or any of those things in prison, you have to question his credibility given the fact that these items are recovered and other inmates are saying they exist. So on this subject matter, I pointed out the issue with his credibility, since you may have other evidence that he's tendered, and if that evidence isn't corroborated by some other evidence, particularly objective evidence, you should disbelieve him if he can lie about simple things like cigarettes, cell phones, lighters that are quite prevalent within that unit. Inmate Michael Lewis also testified that he has not seen cell phones. And again, I mean, that certainly is quite questionable given the prevalence of cell phones in that unit. Senior Superintendent Samuels testified that trade in these prohibited items are a multi-million-dollar business, and that as a security manager, a superintendent of prisons, and recently in his role of deputy director, he's coordinated several raids that has unearthed numerous items. He's also conducted investigations that has resulted in the arrest, interdiction, and prosecution of prison officers who have been found to breach their duties and commit these criminal offenses of trafficking in narcotics and other items in the prison. And he testified before you that for trying to crack down on the smuggling of illegal items and prohibited items in the prison, he's faced retaliations. And that's important because as we go on into the submissions, you'll see part of the retaliation is making up false allegations against him so that he can lose his job or so that he could be prohibited from ever working in the correctional environment again. Kevin Pilgrim, who is the superintendent of prisons, he testified that due to the old wooden structures, it is easy for inmates to hide contraband, and that poses challenges for correctional officers assigned to these living units. Inmate Patrick Narine testified about the availability of improvised weapons and the propensity of inmates for violence and threats to the lives of custodial officers and their families. You heard evidence following the search that Superintendent Pilgrim met with the inmates on the evening of March 2nd, 2016, before he left off duty. And he testified that he addressed the living unit as a collectivity, and that he addressed the inmates individually, those inmates that wanted to speak to him. And he said that there were specific concerns that were raised with him. And some of the concerns that were raised with him on March 2nd was about lengthy pretrial delays, issues with the Director of Public Prosecution, issues with the manner in which investigations are done by the Guyana Police Force and charges instituted. He also said that inmates made some complaints about the Joint Services search conducted earlier that day. They were upset that their belongings were allegedly mishandled, and he promised to look into those issues and to get back to them the next day. I will go on to the fire on March 2nd, but before I go on to the fire, I want to address one issue with you, and that's the issue of fire prevention. And Section 228 of the Prison Act deals with
220?
228 of the Prisons Act deals with the fire preventions, and it says all reasonable precautions should be taken against the outbreak of fire. The officer in charge shall cause all firefighting appliances and equipment to be kept prominently posted in every prison and every section of the prison. And our submissions are that the evidence would illustrate that fire drills were conducted a week before the fire. The evidence also indicates in our submissions that the Guyana Fire Service conducted fire inspections, and the Commission has numerous reports going back from 2005 to 2012. I wasn't there for the firefighting evidence, so I'm not sure what explanation is given for between 2013 to 2015, but the Commission may have that within its purview. Commission Counsel asked some questions about the absence of a functioning fire pump at the prison. And the Commission heard the evidence of the Director of Prisons in respect to what steps the Guyana Prison Service took to have the fire pump replaced. And certainly the Director testified that this is a line item in the budget. And so if it's a line item in the budget, it moves from his function as an operational director to the political directorate and to Parliament. The Commission also heard evidence, and this is the evidence that should cause the Commission some significant concern, that there was an absence of fire retardant clothing for the officers, that there was an absence of air supply tanks for the prison officers, and that there was an absence of breathing apparatus for the prison officers. That is an issue that should cause significant concern for the panel. Chief Officer Romulus testified that on March 2nd, 2016, after the prison was locked down, there was only 4 custodial staff on duty, inclusive of him, as the duty supervisor. There was 1 officer in the observation post, and there were 2 officers assigned to guard 1,014 inmates. He testified around 9:25 p.m. He received a radio message from Prison Officer Tucker, who was manning observation post number 1, that there was a fire at the back of the new Capitol Block building. He testified that he attended and that a quarter of a mattress was in fire. And he told you that when he questioned the inmates about the cause of the fire, they said they wanted back their weed and their matic. And he explained to you that matic means their cell phones. You heard evidence that a general call-out was made to officers of the Guyana Prison Service. You've heard evidence that the fire service was called, and you've heard evidence that other members of joint services attended. What is significant for the evening of Friday, what is significant for the evening of March 2nd is you've heard evidence that the prison officers that were assigned to protect the firefighters and the firefighters who were fighting the fire on the evening of March 2nd were the recipients of assaults by various means by the inmates. And you've heard evidence that two officers, Officer Lykin and Officer Barker, I believe it was, that they both had substances thrown in their eyes and were temporarily blinded. You also heard evidence that Assistant Superintendent Hudson was injured. He sustained injuries to two parts of his hands as a result of being poked by jukers. You heard evidence that the prisoners were very insistent on continuing to light the fires despite the efforts of the fire service. And you heard evidence that it took until 1 a.m. for things to return to normalcy at the prison. You heard evidence that at 3 a.m. on the morning of the 3rd, that the Director of Prisons contacted Deputy Director of Prison Samuels and asked him to return from Mazaruni to Georgetown. And you heard evidence as well that all of the officers that were called into the prison on March 2nd worked through until March 3rd. And you heard evidence that the Director of Prisons slept in his office. The Director on March 3rd conducted a briefing with officers. And word about the Director of Prisons, Director Carl Graham is 54 years old, and he's been employed by the Guyana Prison Service for over 34 years, since it would be 35 years now because he joined the service in 1980. He's a trained crisis negotiator within the prison, and he testified that in 2006 he single-handedly defused a riot at the Georgetown prison. So that's a brief background about the Director. The Director testified that he called a briefing in the morning, and he called a briefing because of the events that occurred on the night of March 2nd. Because of those events, he wanted officers to evacuate the new Capital Block Division and to seize any other contraband that remained. Because if you recall, when I was dealing with the submissions on the Joint Services search earlier, I made mention of the difficulty in locating all of the items that inmates smuggled into the prison. And the fact that they had lighters after the Joint Services search to light fires that evening illustrates the difficulty in finding all the contraband items that the inmates would have in the prison setting. So anyway, the Director asked that another search be conducted and that an assessment be made to determine whether any damage was done to the infrastructure of the building as a result of the fire that evening, and also to determine as well, actually not to determine, but to remove the old mattresses that were in the living unit and to put new ones brought by Food for the Poor. You heard that evidence. So that is the reason why the officers were conducting the search of Capital Block A. Part of the rationale as well was to remove the ringleader. The Director has that responsibility pursuant to Chapter 1101 of the Prison Act. He's granted total control over the administration and day-to-day operation of the prison. And I mentioned that because a question was asked, I think it might have been by one of the commissioners. One of the commissioners said, well, you know, given the fact that fires were lit that evening, why the rush to go in? And another question was asked, well, why not feed the prisoners up before the search? A hungry man is an angry man. Those were two of the comments that we heard while questions were asked about the officers in respect to the search that took place that morning. But we say that exigent circumstances existed that morning. And we say that it was a director that determined the urgency of the situation. It was a director that determined that at that time, in that place and under those conditions, that search had to be conducted, and that search had to be conducted forthwith. And we say that while respectfully the commission can probe and ask certain questions in respect to why a detailed operational plan wasn't prepared prior to the search, why the fire service wasn't at the prison on standby when the search was being conducted, why the tactical services unit of the Guyana police force wasn't on standby at the prison while the search was conducted. The director made a judgment call and an assessment at that particular time that no other joint services needed to be activated for that search. The director did not apprehend or could not have apprehended that events would have turned out the way it did. And we respectfully say that it's difficult. It's difficult to armchair quarterback with the greatest degree of respect the decision of the director on that morning. The significant event that occurred that set off a chain of events was the extraction process. And the commission heard that various teams were set up. There was an extraction team, there were two search teams, and there was a recorder. The extraction team was commanded by Chief Officer Patrick Crawford, and Chief Officer Patrick Crawford provided evidence to you. His team was responsible for extracting the known ringleaders and problematic prisoners during the searching process. And he testified...
Would you just allow me to interrupt you for half
yes,
a
sir.
second? What you think was the immediate cause, the causa causans of that eruption? Forget about the past, the crescendo of the wrongdoings and the what's that. On the second, what do you think was the immediate cause? Because you just said something about search. You said it before.
Well, on the second, we know that there was anger over the fact that the weed and the cell phones were seized. We know that for the second, because the inmates articulated that to Chief Officer Romulus. On the third, we know that the spark was the takedown of Ali Cock and the takedown of Collis Collison.
You would characterize them as ringleaders?
I don't know very much about Steve Alicock, but from what I know about Collis Collison was a person of influence within the prison. We saw he was a person who brazenly had bags and bags and bags of weed on his Facebook page while in prison and from inside of the prison living unit itself. We saw that. We also saw that Collis Collison was posing with other persons that were considered ringleaders in that cell unit. German Otto, for example, you heard a lot of evidence that he, on the day in question, was one of the inmates who was riling up the other prisoners in response to the takedown of Collison, and you've heard evidence about Shaka McKenzie. But if you ask about what the spark was on the third, Collis Collison obviously was the spark. It is his it was after his takedown that the die was cast and everything else that occurred afterwards.
You would urge us to take judicial notice of the Facebook evidence you want to urge on us?
Mr. Chairman, I would say that you can. You can take judicial notice or administrative notice of his Facebook page because it's relevant. It's relevant to the events in question. It's relevant not only to the events in question, but it's also relevant to the person who appeared before you as a witness.
Would the page book, Facebook, evidence point conclusively to read in that?
Yes, it does.
Why do you say that?
He has small packages of individual wrapped items.
How do we know it's neatly read?
Mr. Chairman, in some cases, it doesn't take the panel to have an expert appear before it to consider social context evidence. And that the context within which you are is the prison. And if you're considering the social context evidence, and you're considering seeds, you're considering stems, and you're considering leaves, you can't, well, I shouldn't say you can't. One cannot make the inference that those small individual packages are cenopods or Suriname cherry leaves or
but
something.
But it could be, couldn't it?
Highly unlikely.
That's a subjective judgment.
Well, let me say it. Well, let me put it differently. The probability of it being cenopods or Suriname cherry leaves are slim to nil.
Okay. That's what you would urge?
Yes.
Okay.
So we say that you can consider the Facebook evidence because it's objective evidence as well. You heard evidence that Senior Superintendent Samuels was in Mataruni, and he was asked to return to Georgetown to assist with this operation that was being conducted. That on the evening of March 2nd, Senior Superintendent Samuel slept over in Bartica. And you have an invoice from the hotel where he stayed. You have the registration form, and you have the fees charged to him for that evening. You also have other evidence that shows that he was in Bartica. You have his log from his government-driven vehicle, and you had before you the boat captain log that logged the passengers on the vehicle.
Let us hear you on the role he played on that day.
Yes.
Because there were a lot of allegations swirling around.
Yes, thank you. Now, we say that Senior Superintendent Samuels arrived at the Georgetown prison after the operation commenced, that he was not part of the planning and execution of the operation at the Georgetown prison on March 3rd, 2016, that his order for inmates to leave or evacuate Capital Block B, then A, was clear and it was unambiguous. We say that he ordered the door to Capital Block A to be opened, that he then ordered the door to Capital Block B to be reopened when he was advised that the door to Capital Block A was jammed by inmates, that the inmates' reactions to prison staff, including Samuels, was inappropriate, it was righteous, and it was criminal, including threats to kill officers, to rape officers, and they were actually throwing substances and bricks at officers and spearing officers with improvised weapons. I mean, Mr. Chairman, there's evidence that Senior Superintendent Samuels was wearing a white T-shirt, or a white golf shirt, sorry, with the Guyana Prison Service emblem on it. He was wearing blue jeans. He had a firearm on him. The firearm was tucked in his waist. The firearm was removed from his waist when he was in the living unit, directing prisoners to evacuate the unit. He testified before you that his use of force option was removed because he had to protect his own safety and he had to guarantee officers' safety. So his firearm was removed to provide cover to officers who had no use of force options. Because you heard that there were only two use of force options available. There were batons and there were firearms. And that's something that the commission may wish to look into as part of its remit. What other intermediate use of force options can be available to officers at the prison, so that firearms are the last resort, or that the drawing of firearms be the last resort, whether tasers should be there, whether beanbags should be there, whether stun guns or any other device should be there as an intermediate to. Mr. Chairman, you heard the evidence from a number of inmates, and the bluntest one was an oral evidence before you from inmate Carl Brown, and he tells you that he heard inmates say they light a mattress, and then I heard Gladwell Samuels said, "Y'all lock the door and let them burn their mother's cunt and dead." Excuse the language, but that was the direct language used by Carl Brown. That's what Carl Brown told you, that there wasn't. He told you firstly that Samuels was leading the task force, and that at the point at which Carlson was taken down, Samuels issued this order. You heard other inmates came before you, and they testified to various iterations of Samuels saying to lock the door and let these inmates die. The fact remains, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, that if Senior Superintendent Samuels had made that direction, Senior Superintendent Samuels would have crossed the line on several levels. He would have crossed the line in the criminal realm, he would have crossed the line civilly, and he would have crossed the line as a senior government official. His suitability and his capability would have to be under severe questions if he had issued that order. But our submissions will show that Senior Superintendent Samuels did not and could not have made that order. At the point in which the door was locked to Capital Block A, Senior Superintendent Samuels was not at the Georgetown prison. At the point in which the door was locked or closed, or any other words that's used to describe the point at which that door was pushed in and the key was turned, it was Assistant Superintendent Hudson who was in command of that living unit. There was a cadet officer with him, Holligan. There was a chief officer, Barker, with him. There was another officer named Das, and there was another officer named Lykin. It was Lykin who turned the key. It was Hudson who ordered the door closed. And it was the group of officers who were with Hudson who pushed the door in. And you saw that at the point they pushed the door in, there was a riot. The inmates had rushed the door, and the inmates were poking improvised objects at the officers. That was the point at which that door was locked, and that door was never reopened until the rescue, prior to the rescue and recovery operation beginning.
Let me take you to the second. There was a fire that was lit, if my memory serves me right. That didn't cause any sort of conflagration. So, was that reported?
That was the fire in between the hole in the wall.
Yes.
Was it reported to the fire department?
In consonance with the SOP, yes.
Mr. Chairman, that is a question that you as a panel has to resolve, because this is the evidence that you heard. You heard that when that fire took place, Senior Superintendent Samuels hollered, "Fire, fire, fire." You also heard that Senior Superintendent Samuels, you heard that from the evidence, he said, "Bring fire extinguishers." Senior Superintendent Samuels testified that when he said fire, 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 the SOPs kick in. Mm-hmm. And the SOPs kick in where officers would come up with the extinguishers. There would be, somebody would raise or contact the operations room, and the operations room would contact the fire department.
Was that done?
Mr. Chairman, I cannot say whether or not it's done. I think what I can say is that the panel has evidence. Some officers are saying that it was done. My understanding is that the point at which the call was made to the, let me put it this way. My understanding is one call was made to the fire department from the jail. And the issue that the panel has to resolve is the time at which that call was made, whether it was made when the forest fire was lit, whether it was made after the major fire began at Capital Block A. But Mr. Chairman, one thing that you could take comfort from is it appeared from the timeline that the call was made in very short order to the fire department. It was no more than 8 minutes, from my understanding, that the call was made to the fire department.
You would disagree that the result of that tragic episode was not due to the negligence or abandonment of duty of your constituents?
Mr. Chairman, it was not. I'm going to submit to you very respectfully, Your Honor, that there was no negligence on the parts of the officers, and there was no abandonment of duty on the part of the officers. And this is the way that you have to look at it. If you look at it, you can look at it in a number of ways. So I'm going to address you on that, on the public law matter, on the employment law matter, and on the custodial law matter. In any employment situation, an officer, whether it's a police officer, a prison officer, or any other officer, they have the right to work in a safe environment. In this particular environment, you heard evidence that inmates were throwing fluids at the officers or substances that were burning the officers' eyes and skins. You heard evidence that inmates were poking objects at the officers. All the officers had were shields, batons, and 2 officers had guns. Superintendent Pilgrim and Senior Superintendent Samuels. You also heard evidence and you saw the efforts. You saw the first efforts to out that fire with a hole in the wall. You also heard evidence of the efforts that were made by officers to open the door or to get the door open. You heard evidence actually backtracking that the inmates had even blocked the door earlier before the first evacuees came out of Capitol Block A, and that there was an inmate named, I think it's Marquise or Mark. Yes, you heard evidence about a guy named Marks who got the door open the first time around. But after Collison was taken down, the inmates blocked the door and never removed whatever jammed the door so that officers can get in. And Senior Superintendent Samuels did something important that day when he came here before you. He brought a replica of a door and showed you how easy it would have been to get those inmates out in 30 seconds or less had they removed the object that jammed the door. The question that was asked forcefully, and I think it might have been from Commission Counsel, but it might have been from a commissioner, whether or not the officers should have rushed in through Capitol Block B and go through the hole and evacuated the prisoners. And that question was asked of Superintendent Pilgrim. And Superintendent Pilgrim, and rightfully so, Superintendent Pilgrim described that hole as a fatal funnel. And that's indeed what that hole would have been for officers. That hole would have been a fatal funnel. The officers had no protective clothing. They had no fire retardant clothing. They had no breathing apparatus. They had no air supply mask. And their use of force options were limited in the face of violent inmates. The prison service would have come under severe criticism if those officers had gone on a suicide mission. That is exactly what it would have been. It would have been a suicide mission to go in there to rescue those inmates in the manner that presented itself on that day, where the doors couldn't open, and the only way the officers can get in there was through that hole. They could not, at the point in time where it would have been more beneficial. Had they had the equipment, and had they had the resources, had they had the manpower to dominate that living unit, perhaps they could have gone in. It would have been a hand-to-hand battle with inmates. But if they had the equipment, they could have gone in and do something. But with what they had, they did the best. They did the best that they could under those circumstances. There's nothing else. There's absolutely nothing else that the officers could have done. And this is what I will say to you, Mr. Chairman. When you were looking in the witness box, you didn't only see officers, you saw humans. And you saw humans that related to those inmates. You heard the officers speak of the effect or the impact that the events had on them. And actually they understated the impact and effect. Because they're men, they're military men, they're men in the joint services, and they don't want to appear vulnerable. But the officers told you the impact of what happened on March 3rd for those officers. It's life-altering. None of them will ever be the same.
Let us look at it from the standpoint of the inmates. Do you think, subjectively for them, they despaired of their lot, and they decided that they will set the fire ablaze to make a point, and they have no concern about the consequences. Do you think that's a factor that we ought to take into account?
That is a significant factor. That is a significant factor. The inmates who lit that fire continue to light fires. They did this in March. You know, one of the officers was pinned when he was giving you the evidence. That was Officer K.H., the assistant superintendent. He was pinned when he gave you that evidence, and he was pinned because he could not make sense of it. That why people with any sort of rational thought or thinking would block a door to their rescue and continue to light fires. Not controlling for the fact that a fire can be a good servant but a bad master if it reached the point at which it did on the day in question. The inmates, the ones that lit that fire and continue to poke the officers, continue to assault the officers in their effort to get them out of there and to extract them from that unit, they significantly played a role in their death.
Let me hear you on your recommendations.
Mr. Chairman, the recommendations are those which, this is what we will say. We will say that there was a report of a board of inquiry into the escape of 5 prisoners from the Georgetown prison on February 23rd, 2002 that was laid over before the commission. And that report has numerous recommendations that were not implemented. And we would say that as a commission, you for the evidence in respect to 2016. But in the context of 2002, we would urge you to revisit that report as well to see if there's any recommendations that were contained in that report that if they were implemented could have prevented the fatalities and the injuries that occurred on March 3rd of 2016. And we would urge you to forthwith recommend that those recommendations from the 2002 report be implemented. In terms of recommendations, you have a series of recommendations in the witness statement of Superintendent Kevin Pilgrim that we adopted for the purpose of these submissions. You also had a series of recommendations from Senior Superintendent Samuels that we adopted for the purpose of these submissions. And what I've done, Mr. Chairman, is in the fulsome submissions, and I'm sorry they're so long, but so lengthy, but I wanted to go through the evidence.
You mean the submissions?
Yes, the written submissions.
Not your address?
Not my address. My address is coming to a close. Yeah. The written submissions were as exhaustive as possible because we wanted to make sure that you had a fair understanding of the case from our perspective. Okay. But we've included the submissions of Senior Superintendent Samuels and Superintendent Pilgrim. But I've included other recommendations as well. And some of those recommendations including ensuring the panel recommending that adequate resources are put into the prison system so that officers have adequate clothing, adequate equipment, and adequate human resources. Human resources is a significant issue in the prison service. There are not enough bodies. And so that is a recommendation that the panel should really urge on the minister and the president, that resources be put into the prison system. The fact remains, Mr. Chairman, and you've heard that from Senior Superintendent Samuels, is that those wood buildings can be historic relics. I was at Mazaruni Prison yesterday, and I got to tell you, Mr. Chairman, I am amazed at the marvel of the place. And the same goes for those wood buildings at the Georgetown prison. Those wood buildings had their place, and their place now are historic relics. Those are not places to house prisoners. And so what it remains is that governments do not want to hear that they need to pump money into prisons. But in the particular context that you find yourself tasked to make recommendations to, we would submit that it's appropriate that the government pump money into the prison and build a brick prison. You've heard the evidence from Director Graham. Director Graham paused before he unburdened you with the pain that he feels when he saw the Marriott got built way after a brick prison began construction within the walls of the Georgetown prison, and that brick prison hasn't even reached anywhere close to completion. And so the recommendations must be those that are contained in the reports that I mentioned to you and in the recommendations of the officers, but also that a new prison must be built, that proper equipment must be there for officers. You also may want to look at the issue of sentencing guidelines, because you have one judge, Justice Navindra Singh, who is responsible for 9/10. 90% of the sentences over 50 years is brought down by one judge in Guyana. And so when I speak of that, you may want to turn your mind as well to an aging prison population. Because if inmates are being sentenced to 50 years and more without any prospect of release, you have the situation of an aging population in there, and the contingencies or the eventualities that flow with having an aging population. You need walkers, you need a geriatric ward, you need geriatric nurses, any number of things, and the health cost that comes with it. So perhaps in the context of where you have one judge whose sentences are quite disproportionate, sentencing guidelines may assist. And it may be something that the commission may be able to recommend, so that the Judicial Commission or the Judicial Council in Guyana can treat with that. Mr. Chairman, let me say that let me just see if there's anything else I need to say, and then I'll close off. A moment's indulgence, please. Mr. Chairman, not inevitably, the officers would raise a concern that goes to the core of their work in the prison. And the officers tell me that they appreciate the submission that I made, that you must recommend more resources, and human resources particularly. But the officers are telling me that there should also be a rethink of their salary and their allowances. So they're saying that you may want to consider whether or not their salary should be bumped up, and whether or not various allowances, including risk allowance and out-of-town allowances, should be implemented and bumped up so that it's more attractive to persons who may want to join the prison service.
Are prison officers and members of the public service?
Mr. Chairman, my understanding is in some way they are public servants, but in other ways they are joint services members. So it seems like they're caught in a penumbra of uncertainty as to whether they're full public servants or whether they're members of the military.
Well, perhaps it's not either or, perhaps it's both.
And perhaps it's both, indeed.
Well, if so, I'm wondering if they didn't have a voice when the commission that predeceased me sat right here.
That's right, the Dr. Lodgman Commission.
That's right.
Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't be able to say, but Mr. Chairman, what I would say is that I thank you and the commissioners for the opportunity to appear before you today and the commission counsel. Those would be my submissions.
Okay. You want to go? You want to say that? You have any questions?
Mr. Peters, I thank you for your submission.
Yes, Madam Commissioner.
97 pages, though recently received only this morning. And summary, hopefully received today, will be hopefully received today. Sitting as a human rights activist as well as a penal reform expert, I would need to go through in minute detail your submission, holding, of course, all the principles, all the necessary principles of accountability, social justice, non-discrimination, as well as, of course, the legal instruments, be they the Constitution of Guyana, the COI Act, all the international and regional instruments that pertains to the management of prisons, etc., and all the ancillary pieces of legislation and guidelines. Thank you very much for your submission.
Now, Madam Commissioner, do you have any questions in respect to any of
No,
those
sir,
instruments
at
that you need
this
to
point, no questions.
Very well.
Thank you.
I've exhausted mine. Thank you for the presentation. Erudite and quite fitting of able counsel. You will convey to your colleague that I missed him. I would have liked to hear him. I understand he's indisposed.
That's my understanding too, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. May he be restored to regular health as soon as possible.
I'll pay him a visit and convey your thoughts.
Yes.
Thank you.
I think the Commission Counsel has something to say.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This morning, the proceedings of this commission has come to an end. We have secured the testimonies of several inmates, an ex-inmate, fire officials, police officials, prison officials, a former prison official, the pathologist, the chief medical officer, chief probation officer, the chairman of the parole board, and the chancellor of the judiciary. The commission has before it several reports and other materials which it will be utilizing in conjunction with the previously mentioned testimonies to formulate its report. That report will be laid before His Excellency Brigadier David Granger on or before the 31st of May 2016. On behalf of this commission, I would like to thank you for your kind patience throughout this inquiry. Thank you.
The public sittings have come to a close, but the real work begins now. Thank you.